Hey everybody, it's Ian King. This is one of the sessions we'll be doing within the Ask the Master series. In this instance, we call the inquirer Echo Lima for privacy, and this person has been a follower of my publications for multiple decades, or say at least 3 decades to their credit. So what I do is I pick out questions that I get sent to me that I believe are worthy of having more than just a written response, and respond to them with words in these sessions. So let's get stuck into it. We're going to go to screen share and have a look at the original message. Okay, so we're going to be talking about training injuries and age, which was the subject raised by in the Ask the Master email. So this is a screenshot of the email, and we're going to dissect it paragraph by paragraph. So Echo said, I'm writing simply because I've been pondering on and wondering what approach, generally speaking, you'd like to recommend. So the first thing I want to talk about is the fact that he's pondering and wondering. I really encourage reflection. I think we spend more time considering what we're doing, idealization, before we turn to visualization and then implementing the activity. It's far more effective. And so he's generally speaking, what would like to recommend for an otherwise healthy and fit half centurion. So I love the cuteness of that. I'm going to put the elephant out of the room, bring the elephant into the front of it, and just say he's turning 50. And obviously, if I've got mass wrong, I've got my mass wrong. But it's not a big bad thing. It's a reality. And with the current longevity, it's not really that old relative to some earlier generations, perhaps. In terms of maintaining an optimal version of themselves in the long run, well, I think that's a really important question, because we've all made too many decisions in the short term, not considered the long-term implications of our training, and I put my hand up for that as much as anybody else. In other words, a not so young man, well, that's all relative. I've recently worked with around about the age of 70-something, a lifetime cowboy, and incredible athlete. And I'm not interested whether he's 70 or he's 7. He's as driven as he is now as he was then. So age is not that relevant for me. You can wreck your body at 10, or you can wreck your body at 70 and have so age is not the defining factor. So no longer with aspirations of participating in sport. Okay, so that's the foundation. He's part of that large population bubble that we've got coming into the second half of life, and coming into there with some collateral damage, which is becoming even more common these days. So I've started to work for over 3 decades and have accumulated a library of your books and DVDs, and that's for sure. I've seen his name, like many of our clients, through our educational products. I've not met Echo Lima, but certainly know him very, very well by the frequency of his purchases and some of the interactions we've had through email. Now, this is a really important point. I haven't always been as stringent, and I should be, in the application of principle. So this is an interesting point. There's a number of reasons for this, and I'm just going to put a few of them out there. The most common one is because people don't trust what I say, and that's not a huge deal. I've got no skin in the game which path someone takes. In fact, I appreciate people who take a different path, so I can use them as a control group or a study group to understand cause-effect relationships of when you do training that I wouldn't recommend. So from an ethical point of view, I wouldn't give someone a crappy training program just to see how they went with it. But if someone's going to consciously and willingly take on a crappy program, I love it, because I can watch it from a distance, and I do that. I've done that for many decades. But the challenge is this, especially post the turn of the century, there's been a greater divergence between what I teach and what others are promoting, and there's been a greater number of teachers. Everybody's a teacher now. If you've got an Instagram account and a keyboard, you're a teacher. So I understand the market is very diluted, and it's easy to get a little bit for this. In fact, some people have a philosophy, I believe, that the more different influences they pick from, the more effective the program must be. So it's easy to not follow that strategy. That's one reason. Another reason would be, perhaps they did endorse what I've the values I've shared in my book, and they just haven't had the discipline to go through them. That's another possibility. But anyway, it's good admission. Echo's put his hand up that he hasn't done everything he knows he could have done. But he knows my principle. So in case of, to know and not do is to not know, but I won't get too deep straight away. So let's look at the injuries. 3 shoulder dislocations, and once you've had that many, you're in trouble. It's very hard for the shoulder to stabilize with that number of dislocations. And that was a long time ago too. You've been carrying them for 10, 20 years. And an ACL tear, doesn't say whether it's been reconstructed or repaired. 25 years on a basketball court, that's tough because of it's a hard surface, a multiple 360-degree sport. So it's really hard on the knee, stop, start, etc. Depending on what position you're in. But generally, you do get wear and tear from the being on the hard surface alone. And the osteoarthritis that has ensued in the last 5+ years. So when you get to a certain age, your body's ability to repair from that sort of damage diminishes. So if you've got any wear and tear from your younger days, and anybody who's put their body in the line at the peak of their athletic abilities, say in their 20s, is going to have collateral damage from their sport. Hopefully only, not collateral damage from their dryland preparation, which we're seeing more and more now. Hopefully it's from their sport. So I don't mind people getting wear and tear from their sport. I'm less tolerant of seeing wear and tear as a byproduct of dryland training and the inverted commas intention of becoming a better athlete. So yes, he's got restrictions in the shoulder and knee. That's pretty significant because obviously your knee's load bearing, but your shoulder is obviously responsible for a fairly 360-degree moving joint up there. So to have restrictions in both is really quite life limiting. I'll come back to that. I'm sometimes unsure as to how to best integrate some of the ideas, particularly with regard to stretching, selection, strength exercises. So the only time I put out generic programs is, say, in the Get Buff range or similar. Only for publication. I've never used a generic program with athletes, and therefore it was tough for me even to put out those generic programs. I don't expect those generic programs to work for people who have individual conditions or variations. So if you've got the Get Buff program from the book and you're in your 20s, it might have a high conversion rate. But as you get a little bit older or as you get more collateral damage, you really need to have an individualized program. Now, I do my best to provide some information and guidelines about how to deal with some of these joint issues that you're referring to, but I don't expect you to become an expert, and I don't expect you to be able to do as good a job as my high-level coaches in providing you with an individual program. So what I'm saying is, as you get older, as you get more injuries coming through, your need for an individualized program grows. Now, individualized programs don't exist, like rocking horse shit. I read about them in a textbook in the 1980s, and the world will finally get some individualized programs going. And all I see 30, 40 years later is a name change on the top of the program. Everyone's still doing a generic program for their team. So that's not good enough. When you have these individual needs, and every day is different. Once you've got these chronic injuries, every day is different. You need an individualized program. That, yes, it will include the control drills, abdominal work, strength training, etc. So I'm not surprised that you're unsure to put together. You need a little bit more professional skills to individualize your program for an older, injured individual. I've tempted, of course, to simply start one of the Get Buff programs, and that's exactly right. You can start the program, but they're generic. They're not going to be safe or optimal for you to do. End of story. And prioritize different situations, etc. But I'm wondering if getting buffed. Now, this is a whole new different discussion. Let's get into this. I'm also left wondering if getting buffed or staying buff is actually a worthwhile endeavor at this point. So, as you know, I believe that buff's overrated, and that there has been and there's a growing misdirection in sports training on the basis that if you look buffed, you must be a better athlete. That's bullshit. And it's usually driven by physical preparation coaches who are trying to overcompensate for their lack of sporting ability, and their pastime is getting buffed, and therefore they want all the athletes to follow their path. Well, fortunately, some have wisdom and don't do that, like Kevin Durant or KD out of the NBA. He got chastised by his strength and conditioning coach for being too weak and too skinny, and he got a little bit pissed off by that. And when he got drafted and later in his career, he said their number one go-to boy in the combine training program didn't even get drafted, and he was their best on their test scores. They wanted to throw me out, and look at me. I'm not, I was draft pick number one, and look where I am now. So God bless KD for having the courage to do his own thing, because simply getting buffed does not guarantee you a better athlete. But having said that, once you've finished playing sport, you can do what you want. And in terms of, we don't have to be narrow in our training. So there's no reason why Lima can't do a little bit of stuff that would give him the feeling of being buffed, because that's probably all he's after, that sensation. So then he gets into it. If getting buffed as a golfer sport is actually, in so many cases, detrimental, particularly when done to the whims and caprices of the modern fitness industry, then I couldn't help but wonder if I actually even made sense for one to reach a similar goal with regarding to buffness as a goal for life. And yes, there's no reason. In fact, after you've finished your competitive career, you're in a far better position to do the little crappy stuff, the visuals. But as long as you don't drink the Kool-Aid, where there's a belief that simply bashing a muscle, because yes, you can create hypertrophy that way, is adequate. Because if you bash a muscle and get collateral damage, if you change the shape of your body or damage your joints in doing so, then you're still competed to give it to Paul. And what I'm seeing more and more of is this byproduct of hypertrophy for hypertrophy's sake and stuff what it's doing to the rest of the body. I remember a heavyweight lifter in Australia in the early 80s, really, really good lifter, 125 kilo. He lifted the worlds. He used to headbutt the bar as his psych up. And you can say, well, that was effective for him, but it was effective for him until he was bleeding. And when he was bleeding, they used to red light his lips. So he was barred from going onto the lift if he bled. So I would call bleeding when you headbutt the bar a collateral damage or a con of headbutting the bar. So is headbutting the bar going to potentially raise your focus, your arousal levels? Yes. But does it come with collateral damage? Yes. Which one is more effective? Well, you've got to make that decision. And that's the same with weight training. Simply by virtue of having a barbell in your hand does not make an exercise right. Look at the bigger picture. Is this the pros and cons of this exercise suitable for me in my condition? And in Echo Lima's situation, the majority of that generic program will not be suitable. So he needs to have the wisdom of Solomon or a high-level KSI coach individualize the program for him. But physical preparation for sport is no longer really possible for me. Now, that I don't agree with. Physical preparation for sports is no longer really possible for me. Listen, I put athletes on the podium in the Olympic Games by doing control drills. So he can do a control drill. So if an Olympian can do a control drill and not much more and not only make the Olympics, but get on the podium and be a record holder, then don't tell me that you can't do physical preparation. That is showing the value set, thinking that, well, if I'm not doing the 1990s, go heavy or go home, I can't be training. I can't be preparing for sport. That's rubbish. So we need to change that value as an example. The shoulder and knee don't like that anything powerful. Well, there you go. Who said doing things powerfully or even heavy is synonymous for physical preparation with sport? So that's the misnomer. That's the bullshit that's been perpetuated through our industry. And so he says, so I suppose if getting buffed is maybe too silly of a pursuit. Well, not if you want to. You've just got to be smart about it. Stop drinking the Kool-Aid. Stop thinking like the masses and understand there are many ways to roam. Then that leaves strength as physical preparation pursuit for life. Well, what he's conceding then is that instead of getting strong for sport, he can get strong for life. Well, that is a fair conclusion. I just didn't buy into the earlier one. And where does aerobic fit into this? Well, I was the first one to publicly push back on aerobic training, but what people didn't understand is that I was talking about the aerobic base. So when I went into team sports in the 80s, when the misinterpretation of periodization was taking place, there was a perception that if you didn't spend the first 2 months of your training year prioritizing aerobic training, then you couldn't do anything else after that. You couldn't be an athlete. You couldn't sprint because you'd tear a muscle. You couldn't do anything. You had to have a base of aerobic. And that's all I pushed back on. I never said aerobic's bad. And unfortunately, as I said, humans overreact in the short term and underreact in the long term. When I published in the 90s about that pushback on the aerobic base, it was an overreaction to it, and everyone thought, well, I'd better be like Ian and say aerobic's negative. That's absolute rubbish. There are some sports that you wouldn't have any success if you didn't have a good aerobic condition. Now, I do have a different take on how to develop aerobic, but that's not the purpose of the discussion. So yes, Echo Lima, I would expect you to integrate aerobic training into your training program, again, provided it's done in a way that doesn't damage your shoulders and knees. And that's an absolute. So I personally train multiple times a day, and when I don't include that, it's not in my best interests. So it is in your best interest, Echo Lima, to include that. It's just a matter of how, when, how much, etc. So I guess this is my long rambling way of coming home to ask about what the best proposition would be, while at the same time knowing your opinion on basing strength on powerlifting methodologies. Well, listen, I'm a former competitive lifter. I love the sport, but it's a sport. It is not the equivalent of physical preparation. In other words, you can do physical preparation, including strength training, without using powerlifting. It's quite an interesting historical phenomenon that the whole strength and conditioning industry is based upon powerlifting because of the relationship or the attraction between American football and powerlifting. So the only reason majority of sports are doing strength training now is because American football opened the door. People were only hired in college to be strength coaches when the athletic director decided that he would accept strength training preparation for the American football team. And then over the decades, and literally over the decades, not over the years, over the decades, that service then spread to other sports, but it all began with American football. And American football strength training has, in America, been historically based on powerlifting. So I understand that the strength and conditioning industry or the profession or the association is struggling, letting go of the connection between powerlifting and strength training. Want to introduce the subquality of control and stability and integrated it in a new approach to strength periodization. I made it pretty bloody clear that I'm not a person who buys into that belief that powerlifting and strength training for sport are synonymous. So yes, hopefully that's pretty clear to you, Echo. I know this is not the typical demographic you deal with, older non-athletes, but I'm taking my chances. Listen, as I said earlier, you could be 20 and have more damage than you've got, and I'll deal with it. You could be 70 and have that or more, and I've dealt with it. So there's nothing new about what we're doing here. You're a human body. You've got collateral damage because you either gone hard or made interesting training decisions, and I've done them both. So this is not judgment there. But don't fear. Whilst yes, the majority of athletes I've trained have been at the peak of their athletic career in their 18 to 28, 18 to 38 sort of age range, it doesn't mean that we don't get the opportunity to transfer that skill set, that professional skill set, into any age and any condition. So don't feel like you're a leper. Okay, so that was a very brief chat about answering some of the questions that Eka Lima had about being 50 or coming up to 50 and having collateral damage. And hopefully some of that information has been relevant to other people. Obviously, I will also be providing Eka Lima with a written response that goes into more personal, specific nature than this. I just wanted to take this opportunity to share his story with all of you. Okay, so hopefully I've also stirred up a little bit of thought or questions amongst coaches on the line. So Nick.
Yeah. Hi. Yeah. So just want to comment Echo Lima on his questions. And also I think that's the trend of the industry right now. Now, I was wondering if you can speak more about the trends that you've seen over the past 4 decades of experience. And what's your recommendation? Because everyone loves new trends.
Yeah, it's been a really interesting journey. This is my 5th decade, so obviously I've seen the trends. I'd like to think that we've advanced. The only thing that advanced is technology, the ability to measure. Professional competency has gone nowhere, which is it's tough to watch. I think it's harder for an athlete now. There was a time when you couldn't find the information, and now you can find too much information, but which one do you use? I remember when I first heard that Charlie Francis had written a book, and it was in obviously post Soul in '88. I only knew that he'd written the book because I met someone from his country, and they told me about it. And it took him about 2 years to get a copy from that country. Or if you wanted to get a book out of Germany, et cetera, it was really hard to get information. There were people writing some really good stuff in some of the bodybuilding magazines back in the 60s and 70s, and you just couldn't find them unless you lived in close proximity or knew somebody, knew someone. So we're blessed with access of information. We're cursed with excessive information. So the 2 greatest trends that concerned me in the 1980s, which inspired me to develop the lines of movement concept, hip dominant, quad dominant, upper push pull, vertical, horizontal, etc., was quad dominance from squat being incredibly popular and horizontal pushing dominance from bench press being incredibly popular. Well, guess what? Not only has that not been reduced or changed, now we've got 2 newies that have been added to it. And those 2 newies are due to trends. So there's been a trend towards variations on the dumbbell, shall we say? And I'm going to be straight. Trends don't just organically evolve. Trends are a byproduct of someone designing an equipment and finding a way to teach you how to do it. So I watched, for example, in the 1980s and the 1990s, a company in America who used to sell track and field equipment. And obviously they weren't happy with their sales because towards the end of the 1990s, they switched their distribution model to include everything that you buy. Like, instead of going to the pool shop to buy a pool noodle, you'd go and buy pool noodle off them. And they promoted a seminar series called Functional Training, and they sold the toys. And that was, for me, that trend didn't happen organically. That was a trend driven by commerce. So be aware that the trends are driven by commerce. So the trends, the diversity of equipment that's come in post-2000 has resulted in two new imbalances, and that is the rotational imbalances and thoracic extension imbalances, as I refer to them, and I speak more about them in my 2018 How to Transfer Strength Training book. They are more insidious than the early two, than the 1980s two. So my transition from the legend, Reg Park, who sits above me and watches over me every day, the transition from his physique and his predecessor's physique to Arnold Schwarzenegger's physique, and Arnold was his protege in some regard, not completely. That was a transition that scared me and motivated me to investigate why. But the two more recent muscle imbalances through to the equipment trends or the training methodology trends. Yeah, so Victor, yes, 1980s strength training was not popular. Nobody did strength training. No one studied strength training. I was the only person in my university who had any interest in strength training. But in the 1990s, the switch flicked. Everybody in academia wanted to became a strength expert. I had a South African come to seminars and dialogue with me, who had a PhD in mathematics or something like that, and used to present on some pretty weird stuff. And all of a sudden in the 1990s, when strength training became academically popular, he saw it as a pathway to, move to another country and promote himself by being a strength expert. And I never had a conversation with him about strength training in the decade of knowing prior to that, and all of a sudden he's a strength expert. So the 1990s, whilst it raised acceptance of strength training, also attracted people to the industry who had no really heart and passion in that genre of training. So it was some of a disappointment to see that. I mean, I had a postgraduate colleague who he never left the universal machine in the 1980s and had no interest in strength training other than, that 2 sets of 10, 2 times a week, but switched off aerobic PhD to a strength PhD in the 1990s because it was a trend. Strength training research became the trend. So we had the trend of research come through, and then we had all the equipment to follow. And we could talk forever about how equipment, in my opinion, drives the trends, but I probably bored everybody on that one. So yeah, the trend in this case is not your friend, would be what I would say. How was that, Victor?
Thank you. That was good.
Excellent. Any other questions?
Not really a question, Ian. More a comment. This the individual asking the question. It's very interesting because I'm currently going through a very similar phase as a soon-to-be 40-year-old with collateral damage myself from poor training decisions and so forth. So it's been very interesting to listen to you speak, and I think you talk about individualization of a program. I think it's so important, obviously, but as a person with collateral damage and that, I think it's even more important to find that program or path that suits your situation. As you said, that it cannot be followed through a book, even your books. So it's been very interesting.
Yeah, it's great to see you relate, because I think it's probably the biggest demographic in the world is the situation we've just been talking about. And I don't know whether it was a cost-saving measure that people just follow a generic program or the lack of commitment, but I'm hoping that later in life that they may have the resources to hire a suitable professional. When I say suitable professional, I'm not endorsing anyone who doesn't, unless they can write an individualized program. So it's really important that if they're going to spend their money, do it in that regard, and someone who empowers them rather than the personal training model of the world, which is, I've got a supervisor who work out 3 times a week, and that's the only service I provide. So I'm really important for me to hear that you relate to that, because it is a massive market. And I don't say that from a marketing perspective, but it's probably the hugest bubble and the tough thing for me to watch is the younger ones coming through, and I'm not talking about athletes because that's a different story, but even general pop or get buff pursuit. Some of the training shit that I see, I don't watch social media per se, but you turn on the device and it pops up and you see some really interesting videos. And I say, no, that's fantastic. You're going to get short-term hypertrophy, fantastic. But in a certain period of time, you're going to pay the price for the collateral damage for what you didn't know you were doing to your body. Because strength training of all the 4 dominant physical qualities, and yes, I believe there's 4 dominant physical qualities, not just strength and conditioning, or should be that. Strength training has the greatest potential to structurally change your body faster than the other 2. And so it has a double-edged sword. It's an insidious double-edged sword. It can work for you or it can work against you. And it's very hard to reverse once you create these imbalances. And I don't care whether you're the Rock on TV with the head sticking so far forward, as a byproduct that it wasn't there some years ago, and it's got nothing to do with acting. The collateral damage has been done by the next generation, because people who are teaching have not paid their dues to understand what they're doing. And when you train somebody, you are changing the shape of their body for life, and that is something that I wish would be taken a little bit more seriously. Phenomenal industry. I can do a weekend course and become a service provider. We don't have anything that would align with a specialist in medicine, who's done 16 years of full-time study and probably worked for 8 of those or 12 of those full-time at the same time. It just doesn't exist. Closest thing would be our coaching program, which takes about 10 years to graduate from. So we're getting people with inadequate education empowered to change people's bodies, typically for the worse in the long term, forever. And people are paying them to do that. So, what you and I have got and what Lima got is going to be very small compared to what we're going to see coming through. So, yeah, there's going to be in fact, I did notice a shift post-2010 when more and more personal trainers wanted to know the keys to the universe and how to be a rehab specialist. My attitude is, unless you know how to prevent an injury, you've got no business rehabilitating them. Unless you can predict an injury, don't tell me that you can prevent it. So, for me, injury rehabilitation is a step to learn after injury prevention, and that's obviously requires discipline and delayed gratification from our colleagues. So I appreciate Lima shooting in that email. It's more relevant, I believe, than he appreciated, and I appreciate both of you being on the call to contribute. So thank you.